Hello and welcome to When Disaster Strikes, a webinar for journalists from the Resilience Media Project at the Earth Institute of Columbia University. I'm Dale Willman. The goal of the Resilience Media Project is to help journalists in their coverage of systemic grand challenges like pandemic and climate risk. Right now we do that by giving journalists tools to better cover issues surrounding the pandemic and other immediate topics and to show them how to better envision stories that look towards solutions. And speaking of risk, now more than ever, we face a world filled with compound risk. Wildfires are fueled by extreme heat and exacerbated by drought. Some people may be killed this summer as they're forced to choose between riding out a hurricane at home and evacuating to a shelter in the midst of a pandemic. Journalists need tools to cover compound risk, and that begins with a greater understanding of risk and how to cover it. Too often we look at risk, a hurricane, a wildfire, a pandemic, in isolation. But in order to best understand how to report on risk, we need to know what risk is, and that's what today's program is all about. Our hope is that through this webinar, you'll be given tools that can be used to better inform your communities and how to prepare for and respond to risk. We have a wonderful group of people working with us today. I will offer brief introductions for now. Radley Horton is a climate scientist with Columbia University. Jeff Schlegelmilch is the Deputy Director of the National Center for Disaster Preparedness. Susanna Camargo is a scientist at Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory. Molly Mowry is the founder and CEO of Wildfire Planning International. Rosemary Smallcomb is a District 1 supervisor at Mariposa County, California. Bill McLaughlin is the fire chief at Ketchum, Idaho, and Michael Kotis is senior editor of Inside Climate News and author of Megafire. We'll get to our guests in a moment, but first a quick housekeeping note. I've turned off the chat function of Zoom. I've done this not because it's not a useful tool, but as moderator, it can be quite distracting. However, we'll have time at the end for your questions, so here's how we're going to do that. So be sure and get a piece of paper for this. We're going to use onlinequestions.org. You want to go to that site. Once you're there, you'll enter a code in the space for the event number, and that code is 200629. That's 200629. Once you enter, you'll find a space to write your questions. In case non-journalists have managed to join us, let me say that journalist questions will be answered first, so we're going to be on the honor system. If you are a journalist, please write the word journalist and then write your question. With online questions.org, one of the good things about it is that if you see a question that interests you, you don't have to ask it again. Like the question you see in front of you, and it will rise to the top, and we'll go to those first. So we're going to begin this workshop with a couple of speakers outlining two specific types of risks. Then we'll discuss compound risk before we go to our scenario, and we'll end up with your questions. With all that said, let's ask our first guest to unmute themselves and join us. Molly Mowry is the founder of Wildfire Planning International. Her organization works with communities across the United States and Canada to help address challenges associated with what is known as WUI, the Wildland-Urban Interface, which is a great acronym. That's the area where homes or other structures meet the areas where fires can thrive. Molly will talk to us about wildfire. Molly?
Thanks, Dale. As for sound check, can you hear me okay?
I certainly can. Thank you.
Great. All right. Well, welcome everyone, and thanks for the invitation to be here and speak about Wildfire Basics. Dale gave me 10 minutes, so I packed in a lot of information in the next 10 minutes, and I'm also looking forward to the speakers and the other perspectives on the call today. So I thought I would start with, in very technical terms, what is a wildfire? And a wildfire is any unplanned and uncontrolled wildland fire, which could include unauthorized human-caused fires or escaped prescribed fire projects. You may sometimes hear the terms forest fire or brush fire to describe specific types of wildfires, but for the purposes of today, I'm just going to refer to them all as wildfire. And wildfires occur across the US at different times of year, depending on the local weather conditions, the season. In fact, we have almost 70,000 wildfires a year on average. You just don't hear about many of them because they're often insignificant in size or impact, typically because they get put out so quickly. Another thing to note is that wildfires are primarily human-caused, especially near developed areas where there tend to be more people. This does also vary by region. Some areas, particularly where I am in the Rocky Mountain West, we have a much higher instance of lightning-caused or natural fires, Whereas in some states we've worked, such as in the Midwest or the South, almost 100% of their fires are started by humans. And when I say started by, I don't just mean intentional fires or arson. Many of these are accidental fire starts, like burning debris on a windy day and having it escape, downed power lines, or using machinery outdoors and a spark catches and burns in nearby grass and becomes an out of control wildfire. So it's also really important to note in this context that not all wildfires are bad, so to speak. Some wildfires under the right conditions bring positive benefits to our environment, such as allowing tree and plant species to reproduce from the heat of the flame. So when you hear that a wildfire has consumed a high number of acres burned, it can be somewhat misleading. Bigger does not always mean worse. It really depends on the location of the fire and other factors. However, many wildfires are bad in the sense that they have impacts to humans and the environment, and that's of course why we're here today. So I want to give us a really quick history lesson to appreciate why we're in the situation we are. I'm going to highlight 3 historical influences that have had significant consequences. These are very much simplified for the purposes of the time that we have today, and generally though, I just want to orient you to these narratives. So first, centuries ago, when Europeans began colonizing what is now the US, they brought with them intensive agriculture and grazing and mining and logging practices. And these practices really altered where and how wildfires occurred. And we have several unfortunate and horrific examples, including the Peshtigo fire in 1871, which was in Wisconsin, which killed more than 1,000 people. And you don't necessarily hear about this because it occurred at the exact same time as the Great Chicago Fire in 1871. But it was a really early indicator of a frontier fire that occurred in terms of how land use alterations were reshaping natural disaster events. Second influence, not only were wildfires threatening people, but they were also threatening timber values. So in the early 1900s, the federal government decided to take the approach to put out all wildfires. This became known, you may have heard of it, the 10 a.m. policy, because all fires were supposed to be suppressed by 10 a.m. the next morning. This initially was quite effective, but it also changed, and over the decades, the health of forests by allowing many more trees to grow in areas that were previously naturally managed by wildfire. So we began to have an oversupply of trees. Third, meanwhile, we as humans were building and spreading ourselves out into wildfire-prone areas across the US, which wasn't always recognized as a problem because we were successfully suppressing most fires. There were a few notable warnings in California in the early 1900s, but wildfire at that time was seen mostly as a California-only problem. So over time, we've created this perfect storm for wildfire disasters in terms of building in the wrong places, often with flammable materials, allowing forests to become unnaturally overstocked and unhealthy, and then getting into a cycle of suppressing all wildfires and increasingly disrupting natural ecological processes. And now things are getting worse. So we know that wildfires do indeed affect many areas outside of California. As I mentioned, there's 70,000 of them across the country every year. And we have climate change. And I want you to think of climate change not necessarily as the cause of these extreme fires, but more of an accelerant for what all of these underlying conditions that we created are leading to in terms of destructive fires. In other words, climate change is exacerbating what was already an unwelcome situation for wildfire events. And now we have, of course, a pandemic, which I know will be talked about further in this scenario. So we're beginning to see the consequences of these influences and future warning signs. Some of our recent worst fires, like the Camp Fire that burned through Paradise in Butte County, California in 2018, is a good example of what many of us in the industry believe we will see more of. It's worth noting that impacts from wildfires are very broad. We typically measure them as acres burned, homes burned, lives lost, sometimes dollars spent to respond to the fire and property damage. But there are a number of other social issues and economic impacts and environmental challenges which can last decades after the fire is out. Paradise, for example, the drinking water became laced with benzene, which is a volatile compound linked to cancer. This was due to the extreme heat of the firestorm, creating this toxic cocktail of gases and burning homes that got sucked into the water pipes when the system depressurized from use by residents and fire. So that's taken months just to try to understand how they can rebuild their infrastructure. Other issues are mental health disorders, uneven economic recoveries, and long-term displacement of residents. So there's a host of issues that we're starting to see that have these long-standing impacts. So in the few minutes I have left, just want to cover generally what our communities and policymakers are doing about this. To change these outcomes, we have to have a very mini fire science lesson. This is just your science primer for the day. So fire operates on the principles of combustion. And in order for something to burn, it requires heat, fuel, and oxygen, which fire practitioners refer to as the fire triangle. And in a wildfire, heat is generated from an ignition source, human or lightning caused. The fire then can spread to other fuels. And these fuels are natural or built. So landscaping, natural vegetation, structures, infrastructure, any of this combination. And there are several ways that wildfires spread. The primary way, or the primary reason, or what's responsible for many home losses, is through embers. So some of the smallest smallest means of transferring heat. So the key takeaway here is there's always a reason why something burns. It has to meet the principles of combustion. You may often hear, interviews that's the emotional resident after a fire that says, it was by the grace of God that my home didn't burn. We understand that emotion, but we have to recognize that it also, there were principles, there were drivers behind this of why something does or doesn't burn. So conversely, if we alter these elements of the fire triangle, the heat, the fuel, the oxygen, the fire will behave differently. And if you remove any of these elements, the combustion process can't sustain itself. So that's what many of us as practitioners spend our time on, altering the ways in which fire can spread or eliminating fire altogether. This is fire prevention, fire suppression, fire mitigation. Many of these tools you're probably familiar with. I, for example, work helping communities understand their building codes or their landscaping codes or subdivision codes. How can you alter some of those requirements of where you put those built fuels? Other practitioners work with fuel treatments and forest health management. We work on community wildfire protection plans as a profession where multi-agencies are engaged in these plans. Many emergency responders are working on how they can improve their response capabilities. There's early detection systems, et cetera. So there's no one thing that communities should do. There are many things. And it's becoming all the more important when we bring in compounding risk factors, which we'll talk about later. So just to keep key points to close, wildfire is a hazard that we can influence at different scales. It requires the properties of combustion to be met in order for it to sustain itself. Climate change is accelerating conditions in our environment and developed areas that were already conducive to destructive wildfires. The solutions to wildfire target a range of long-term and short-term strategies. And it took decades to get into this situation. So it will take time and resources and commitment to achieve effective outcomes, because we know this wasn't an overnight problem, so it's much more than an overnight solution. So thanks, Dale. I'll turn it back to you, and I will be here for the duration of the time.
Great, Molly, thank you. And we'll be talking more about how compound risk plays into wildfires when we get to the scenario. So thanks for that quick primer. Susanna Camargo is the Lamont Research Professor at the Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory at Columbia University. Her specialty is ocean and climate physics, and she's going to talk to us about hurricanes. Susanna, thanks for joining us.
Hi. Thank you so much for having me here. Can you hear me?
Yeah. Absolutely.
Okay. So I'm going to talk about hurricanes. We are in the beginning of the hurricane season. The hurricane season in the Atlantic starts officially in June 1st and goes until end of November. We actually already had 4 storms this season, which is a busy start. So when we talk about the hurricanes, we usually think about the Atlantic hurricanes. But in reality, we have these kind of storms around the globe. They have different names. So they're only called hurricanes in the Atlantic and in the Eastern Pacific. In the Western Pacific, they're called typhoons. And but they're exactly the same phenomena. And we also have them in the Indian Ocean, in the Southern Hemisphere. So the general name that we use for them are tropical cyclones. So they typically happen, so giving a primer or basics of tropical cyclones, they typically happen in the late summer, early fall in the hemisphere that we're considering. So in the northern hemisphere, that's why we have the peak hurricane season between August and October. They happen in most of the ocean basins, not all of them. Depends on the climatological conditions. For instance, you do not have hurricanes in the Southeast Pacific, for instance. And then they have a typical lifetime that is comparable to humans, let's say. They usually start as a weak disturbance, and then some of them then are able to intensify and become tropical storms, and that's when they receive a name. If they intensify more, depends on the environmental conditions, then they become a hurricane or a typhoon. And then within a hurricane and typhoon, usually we use the Saffir-Simpson scale that varies from 1 to 5. So sometimes we have a lot of hurricanes that just stay over the ocean and don't lead to a lot of impacts. So when they do make landfall and affect land, then we have a range of hazards that can lead to lots of impacts. So first of all, what we think about, and it's what the Saffir-Simpson scale is defined from, are the winds. So we usually have the Saffir-Simpson scale is based on winds, and so these are the wind damage that we think about. Then we have the rainfall associated with the hurricanes. So the Saffir-Simpson scale actually is not related to rainfall. So do not, when a storm is more intense, not necessarily we have more rainfall. They are independent. Then we also have the storm surge associated with your storm. So when the storm comes to the shore, it's basically pushing all the ocean water into the shore, and then you can have flooding associated with that as well. And on top of that, you can also have tornadoes that are spun by the hurricane. So you have this huge combination of hazards. Then you can think of already at things in terms of a compound hazard. So what determines a hurricane season? So for instance, we can have some hurricane seasons that that are very busy. We have lots of hurricanes. We're talking about hurricanes all the time. And some that are very quiet. So there's a lot of what we call variability from season to season, and even without in between a season. Sometimes we have a period within the season that we have lots of hurricanes happening, and the rest of the season is very quiet. So one of the things that determined, for instance, in the case of the Atlantic, is how warm the ocean in the Atlantic is. So if you have a warm Atlantic like we have now, you tend to have a more active season. The other factor that's important for the Atlantic is the El Niño Southern Oscillation. This actually happens in the Pacific Ocean. So that's when the Pacific's warmer than the normal, but we have what we call a teleconnection, which is this how the ocean in the Pacific is influence the atmosphere in the Atlantic, and that modifies how the winds are in the Atlantic in a such a way that when you have what we call the El Nino Southern Oscillation, you tend to have fewer hurricanes in the Atlantic. And when you have the opposite, which is La Nina, you tend to have more hurricanes in the Atlantic. Right now, the forecast for this season is to have a normal to above normal season, because the Pacific is forecast is for either neutral or a La Nina that leads to a more active season. And also the Atlantic is quite warm. So the forecasts are all for normal to above normal for this season. And then comes the question of climate change. So what do we know now that how climate change influences hurricanes? So as Molly mentioned, climate change is similar to wildfires. Climate change doesn't cause hurricanes. Hurricanes are part of the climate system. So what climate change can do is modify the hurricanes. So the main, we have a range of impacts that the climate change can have on hurricanes, and some we know better and we are more confident on the response of climate change, and some we are less, we understand less or with less confidence. The one that we most understand is the effect of sea level rise. So you have sea level rise that's associated with climate change. So what's going to lead to that? You have a higher level of storm surge. So independent of what happens with the storm, just because you're starting on a higher level, you end up having more flooding associated with storm surge. The other factor that we know quite well, and we expect that we have more intense hurricanes associated with climate change. So these in terms of the wind speed and sea level pressure associated with the hurricanes. The other projection that we know quite well is that we have the rainfall associated with hurricanes is supposed to increase with climate change. So other factors, so for instance, frequency, are we going to have more or less hurricanes in the future? Then that's when we start having the projections are not so robust, and there's a lot of it's the state of the art what we are still doing research on. A lot of projections are for fewer hurricanes globally, but there are some cases that we have projections for more of them. So that's something that we are currently investigating. So when one storm happens, that's usually what I get a phone call from a journalist and ask me, okay, did climate change cause this hurricane? So this is the wrong question. So what we can say is how we can try to understand how much climate change influenced that storm. For instance, in the case of Harvey, there were a lot of studies, and that they showed how much of the rainfall associated with Harvey was increased due to climate change. And those estimates varied from 6% to 30%. So we have more rainfall associated with Harvey due to climate change. This is the kind of questions that we are trying to answer now. But this has to be done event by event. So on top of that, we have that the whole coast is much more, has much more construction, many more people, infrastructure. So if you have exactly the same storm that you have 100 years ago, the impact, the financial impact and social impacts will be just higher, just because you have a lot of more people, a lot of more infrastructure on the way of the same storm. So that's hard to detangle when you talk about the financial impacts of hurricanes. What's due to the, the climate is changing, and just because you have more people and more infrastructure on the way of your storms. I think I'm running out of time, so I'll talk more later. Thank you.
Susanna, thank you. Built risk, of course, is one of those issues that we'll be talking about when we get to our next section. So let's expand on what we've heard now. Radley Horton is an associate research professor at the Earth Institute. His research focuses on climate extremes, tail risks, climate impacts, and adaptation. Radley was a convening lead author for the third National Climate Assessment. He currently co-chairs Columbia's Adaptation Initiative. And Jeff Schlegelmilch is the Deputy Director of the National Center for Disaster Preparedness at the Earth Institute. His areas of expertise include public health preparedness, community resilience, and the integration of private and public sector capabilities. Gentlemen, thanks for joining us. So can you talk to us a bit about what compound risk is? And Radley, I think that you're going to go first.
Sure. Thanks, Dale. It's great to have the opportunity to speak to all of you today. Can you hear me okay? Okay. So yeah, I'll start us out on some definitions, mostly from the climate science perspective. So we'll move through three different types of compound events. And the notion here, as we've been hearing, is basically that events can be paired in space, in time, and what we might think of as a single event can actually include many different components. And it turns out that when we do risk assessment as a society, to the extent that we do risk assessment at all, it appears that we have some blind spots in terms of thinking about how vulnerable we may be to more than one event. It's maybe relatively easy for an individual, maybe a city that's thinking about climate and adaptation, to envision a single event, such as a heat wave, and what its impacts might be and how it might prepare. But it's much tougher to think about things like, well, what if the heat wave includes both heat and humidity? Or what if the heat wave happens right after a hurricane has knocked the power out? Or what if our food supply is disrupted by simultaneous droughts in multiple parts of the world? So those are the types of events that we're talking about when we're thinking about compound climate extremes. Of course, as we'll discuss, there can also be compounding relatively outside of the climate space. So we could have that heat wave with COVID-19. COVID-19, of course, intersects in important ways with climate, but at its base, it's not fundamentally a climate issue, although it has important connections. So the key takeaway there would be we need to think about nonlinear impacts, that you might be able to manage one event somewhat okay. You might be able to manage a second separate event somewhat okay, but when you put them together, there can be unpredictable interactions that maybe cause us to break the bank, if you will. And the bank might be financial resources, it might be emergency responders, it might be societal perceptions, investor perceptions of risk. So how do we prepare for those kind of surprises? But to sort of get back to the basics, what are the types of compound extreme events that climate scientists think about? There really are three primary types. The first is what we call a multiple variable or multivariate risk. So this you could think of as one moment in time in one place. So I gave the example before of a heat wave that's accompanied by very high humidity at the same time that temperatures are high. Might produce different risks than you'd think about if you just knew about the temperature alone. The humidity factor combined with the temperature might increase the risk that your power is going to go out because people need more air conditioning. It might cause greater exposure to risk for your outdoor workers, construction workers, farmers, whatever they might be. So we need to think about those two variables. Another example of this first category, this multiple variable risk, is when we heard from Susanna about the tropical cyclone that's approaching. We might have a tendency to just focus on one dimension of the hazard, such as, for example, the storm surge, the water that's getting piled up by the force of the winds and waves piling water on shore. But it's actually a multivariate problem because in addition to that storm surge, we're having high winds at the same time, right? Which might shut down bridges, for example, in advance of the water arriving, posing challenges for evacuation. And it might be accompanied by heavy rain at the same time. In a low-lying area, you might get an amount of rainfall associated with that tropical cyclone that you could deal with in terms of it running off into estuaries, unless you simultaneously had that storm surge. But you put the storm surge together with the rain, suddenly in this unpredictable way, you're getting this kind of back flooding that's very hard to predict. So that's the first category, the sort of multivariate risks. The second category that's really important is sequential extreme events, right? So the example I alluded to earlier is, maybe a city has a decent heat action plan. Maybe they have a decent coastal storm plan. But what if the coastal storm comes right before the heat wave and knocks out power to a lot of folks, makes it so that those with pre-existing health conditions that are going to be especially susceptible to heat can't get access to their medicines, to air conditioning, to visit doctors. So we're need to do a better job understanding the background risk before climate change of these types of sequential extreme events, but also how in potentially nonlinear ways a little bit of climate change, whether it's a little bit of sea level rise or a little bit of warming temperatures, might produce a big change in the frequency of these sequential extremes. If you could somehow, this is a big uncertainty, but if you did find in some regions that you stretched out the length of the hurricane season, if your ocean temperatures were warming up earlier in the season, something we might expect with climate change, arguably that would be one factor that could make it a little easier for you to have an earlier season hurricane. So instead of, that July hurricane, for example, in the Northeast US, which is currently pretty rare, a landfalling July hurricane in the Northeast US. But maybe with climate change, that becomes more plausible, which gives you a greater risk in its own right of an overlapping heat event at that time of year when the sun is still very bright, days still very long, and we, by climatology, have our highest temperatures in the Northeast, which is right around sort of mid to late July, around July 20th in a lot of the cities. So a third category would be, and something to note here with these sequential, it could be the same type of event, it could be different events, right? We also might need to think about simultaneous nor'easters, sequential nor'easters. There might be certain weather patterns that set up that increase the odds that a city, would get hit with 2 or 3 nor'easters in a few week period, or in a 3 week or a month period. And the effects you might see in terms of flooding, damage to dunes, ability to even sort of supply our natural gas infrastructure for heating could be, in a nonlinear way with a lot of tail risks, vulnerable to sequences of nor'easters. So the third category is maybe it might feel a little more esoteric than the last two I described, but it's really just the notion of simultaneous extremes in multiple places. So a classic example of this would be if you have a pattern in the jet stream that might set up during summer, let's say, for example, where you have, instead of just a relatively flat sort of what we call a zonal, just west to east jet stream that keeps cold air to the north, warmer air to the south, it may be that there are times when we get configurations in the atmosphere where the jet stream is wavier. And not only that, but there might be a tendency for those waves, the ridges, to lock in at particular longitudes. So you might have a ridge over the US Corn Belt. You might have another ridge over the breadbaskets of the Ukraine. You might have another ridge over East Asia. If those bulges, if you will, in the jet stream were correlated with each other and locked into place over major breadbaskets, it might be that under each of those ridges, you're going to have a tendency for warm temperatures, sunny skies, high pressure, just like we see on weather maps under the ridge, that gives us long hours of direct sunlight during those long summer days. It can rapidly dry out the land. The absence of rain, the absence of cloud, the absence of strong sort of mixing winds and cool air from the north can lead to flash drought in some regions. So that's an example of how simultaneous connected extreme events in different regions of the world can fairly quickly introduce instabilities that extend far beyond the regions themselves, right? If that can now start to affect food prices, and especially some of the most vulnerable parts of the world that are reliant in some cases on food aid or having to buy staple foods. Even a small shift in prices can have huge impacts. So that's an example of one of these connected events in space. One moment in time, multiple extreme events that could be correlated. And that's another one where with climate change, we're very concerned that just a little bit of warming, even if it doesn't change the jet stream at all, is going to essentially prime the pump to make it much easier when a drought does happen for the land to dry out very quickly through the moisture getting sucked up into the warmer atmosphere that can then hold more moisture. So that's another of these risks that's hard to define because these events are relatively rare now, but likely growing in probability with climate change. So those are a few examples of these kind of linkages, you could say. I tried to describe some physical mechanisms that could cause multiple variables to impact a region, that could cause sequential extreme events in one place, and that could cause simultaneous extremes in multiple places. But I think there's a broader point that'll be relevant as we extend a little beyond the climate space, which is even if there is no kind of direct shared mechanism between these things, we live in an increasingly connected world, right? And it may just be that, in some part of the world, having a couple direct landfall major cyclones in one part of the country, having a really terrible fire season that same year in another, or the next year in another part of the country, even if there's no common physical mechanism other than perhaps climate change just turning up the dial a little bit on these risks independently, we have to ask ourselves, are we close to sort of breaking that bank that I mentioned earlier? Could we be underestimating some of these tail risks, whether it's reinsurers with sort of static assumptions that were never necessarily grounded on that many years of historical data when you try to link these multiple rare events? Are there blind spots in their risk assessment on the financial side, on the investors side, on the government response side? I think you can make a case that we're not fully prepared for these kind of risks. And once you cross those thresholds, as we've seen with COVID-19, there can be a lot of unpredictable cascading impacts of various types. So, I tried to stick in my remarks here sort of primarily to the climate sphere, but as we sort of get to COVID-19, there's all sort of things we could talk about of ways that COVID-19 interacts with the climate issue, for example. So maybe with those remarks about sort of defining the problem, if we want to go to Jeff to sort of hear his thoughts on that, but also what the sort of landscape of resilience, preparedness in the face of some of these types of compound events and hazards looks like.
And Radley, thank you. I want to add in an element to that, the idea of sequential risk. I'd always thought of as being sequential in more natural events. So an earthquake causes a tsunami, but as we saw in Japan in 2010, the earthquake caused this, which caused damage, then caused a tsunami, which accentuated that damage. But mistakes made at the nuclear power plants in the way they responded led to an exacerbation of that. So we had sequential occurrences in that disaster that began as natural that then also became human events that led to knockoff or follow-on risk as well.
Absolutely. And some of those were probably at an earlier planning stage too, failure to kind of consider that you might simultaneously get the earthquake followed by the tsunami. But then also, as you say, the sort of responses after the disaster too. Which is
critical, and we'll talk about that when we get to the scenario too. So thank you for that. And Jeff, your thoughts on what Radley's told us, and if we can move then into to resilience and how we try to build in some level of resilience to avoid these kinds of horrific events, not from occurring, but in creating massive damage.
Yeah.
Absolutely, and actually just picking up on the example of Japan's triple disasters of the earthquake, tsunami, and nuclear meltdown, I think that's a prime example on how disasters cascade into each other and how the built environment, how we manufacture our vulnerability, as well as in some cases, such as climate change and pandemics, also contribute to the overarching threat itself. And so in the case of Fukushima and Japan's triple disasters, a colleague of mine, Daniel Aldrich, has written a book, Black Wave, that actually takes a look at how social structures within communities were actually incredibly important in terms of determining who lived and who didn't, and who recovered faster than others, and that these connections of neighbors helping neighbors actually had more impact on health and mental health than physical infrastructure investments, such as seawalls and evacuation routes, as well as how vertical connections within government help the flow of money come to recovery, since most assistance, whether formal or informal, is usually organized at some point through government verticals. And so these dynamics are all sort of there. It's disasters are complexities upon complexities. It's a very dynamic ecosystem. But all this really comes down to, I always look at it, right, is that there's the threat and the vulnerability. And the threat is the bad thing that's trying to happen. In the cases of climate change, in the cases, as I mentioned, of pandemics, human development is contributing to that. So these are naturally occurring, but they're also amplified through human activity. In the case of pandemics, increasingly living in closer and closer proximity to animal populations we don't normally live in such close proximity to, and then global travel networks, being able to spread it across the world. But then there's the underlying vulnerability we're contributing to as well, too. We're not investing in public health and then healthcare readiness and preparedness systems. Climate change very similarly, right? Puffing out greenhouse gases while at the same time building in floodplains and building in flood-prone areas. We construct vulnerability, as well as contribute to some of these overarching threats. And so that's why, people ask, are we seeing more disasters, or are we just paying more attention? Are we getting better at measuring them? And the answer to both is yes, we are better at cataloging them and measuring them, and we absolutely are seeing more disasters because of those dynamics. And it's also important to note that, it's often said the past is not prelude. A lot of our disaster response systems formally are designed to look at the last 10 years of flooding or the last 100 years of events. And those are not good indicators of the next 100 years or the next 10 years even. As we look at these different ecosystems, we're looking at the politics, we're looking at the built environment, we're looking at social structures, we're looking at all of these different elements. I should add in too, while sort of talking about community and these social structures, there's some work being done now by some researchers out of Pittsburgh and elsewhere looking at recovery programs and US government recovery programs designed to level the playing field, to be there for people, to be, when they don't have insurance, when they don't have anywhere else to go. And a lot of these programs are actually exacerbating inequalities. They're not reducing it, they're amplifying it. They're amplifying inequalities from socioeconomic status through racial and ethnic inequalities across communities. Now, I want to separate the impact from the intention because I can't draw those formal conclusions, although I suspect that really what's driving this is the complexity of it, right? Is that when you have underlying policies that create inequalities in the society, it means that certain people are going to have access to resources and other ones aren't. Now you bring in 15 sets of government paperwork that now need to be filled out for all these different loan programs or assistance programs. Who's going to have the resources and the attorney and the lawyer and the accountant to help you fill that out versus who is dealing with that in addition to lost hours in the service industry and health issues that are disproportionate because we see social determinants of health. So the table for disasters is set long before the disaster ever occurs through our economic policy, through our social policy, through our political arrangements, and through our private sector incentivization of risk and not risk. So I think along these ways, the way that we've been looking at this is how do we rewire those incentive structures? How do we take a look at how these are built? So there was a good study on, I believe it's called Myopic Voters and Natural Hazards Policy or something like that. And it's done by a series of political scientists, and they actually look at voter behavior in the aftermath of disasters. And what they do is they look at voters' response to recovery funding versus voters' response to preparedness funding. And there are some methodological things I might have done a little differently, but I think that on balance, basically the picture that it paints is that voters respond very significantly and very positively to recovery funding, to the tune of every, I forget what the number was, $25,000, $27,000, something like that in recovery funding you bring in buys you a vote. And there's actually even been suggestions that that's been part of electoral policy to try to target certain districts in Florida and things like that after hurricanes. But all that being said is that voters incentivize elected officials for recovery. There is virtually no correlation between preparedness funding and voter behavior. Voters could not care less, based on the data, about, well, maybe they could care less, maybe I'm overstating, but you know what I mean? There's no correlation there. And so instead of asking the question, why are we paying so much for recovery? Why is there so much damage? Why is this so expensive? Elected officials don't have the incentive to respond to that electorally. Similarly, when we look at the private sector, what are the transactions that folks are engaging in? For those who I've noticed in the private sector are getting much more interested in disasters and in climate change are those that are holding on to bonds or longer term financial instruments. The day trading and the stock exchange and things like that are a little tougher to get through, right? Because they're not looking at the 30-year, they're looking at, saving 2 cents on each transaction or something like that. And again, I'm not trying to belittle the field. I'm just trying to say that we have not yet found a way to translate that value, that long-term value, into those short-term transactions that in aggregate really heavily influence our development decisions and where we're going with all of this. And I think that's really the next step. And certainly, with COVID-19, with the increasing coastal flooding from major storms, folks are starting to get the picture here that there is a risk and that there is something that needs to be looked at. So I am helpful in looking at that. And then the other piece that I'll just mention is just the sheer complexity, the sheer sort of hodgepodge of how we respond to disasters adds another layer of complexity on top of everything else I've just said. So to give an example, in the United States, in a disaster, there are as many as 90 disaster assistance programs spread out over 20 agencies. But these aren't set in terms of what is triggered and what isn't. There's a handful that are triggered with a presidential disaster declaration, and then there are others that are triggered under different circumstances. And some of them are triggered when Congress passes emergency supplemental funding. And so all of the different systems that we have for responding to a disaster have actually been built in pieces and not built holistically or strategically. And so what that means is that you may have an assistance program that's not available to you, and then 6 months Congress passes a supplemental, and then they write in a new program that is now available, that is now administered through another agency. But if you apply for that, you're no longer eligible for the other. It just puts more and more burden on the survivors, more and more burden on those in the middle of the disaster. So stepping back at these new trends and getting more into solutions, some of the work we've been looking at and that I've personally been looking more and more at is how do we take systems that are designed to manage uncertainty? Instead of trying to create more and more checklists and more specifics and more formulas for how to respond to disaster, how do we create more systems that are dynamic, that are able to look at multiple disasters happening at the same time? As we mentioned, if you're in a sheltering system with COVID-19, there were, for the tornadoes that happened in the spring, there were some waivers that were issued for families that, for the transitional assistance program. Essentially what this means is that people were able to stay in hotels rather than in a communal shelter. A very good thing during COVID-19, a very important waiver that went through. Wiring these kinds of things in, we see examples of managing uncertainty through in the private sector. The military has used them in different environments. And then also looking at almost a balanced scorecard approach. How do you take these different, because our shoring up against disasters in one way can actually further isolate communities as well too. In Japan after Fukushima, there were communities, there was a lot of money just dumped into seawalls, and communities were saying, we don't want them. We don't want the seawalls. This is our livelihood on the beach. And they were largely ignored and largely cut off and are now sort of permanently isolated and separated and more vulnerable to disasters as a result of favoring one type of resilience, physical, over social resilience, and being integrated with the overall response. So I know I've kind of sprinkled in, I guess, a lot of different things and hopefully somewhat coming together with that. But I think at the end of the day, as we're entering into an age of increasing complexity, The systems that we have to design to respond to these concurrent disasters were not designed to respond to these disasters. You know, following the money gives you a firsthand account on where it's going and where it's not going. Looking into the communities, who's getting help and who's not getting help, is unfortunately very predictable, even though the exact types of assistance that become available may not be. So with that, maybe I'll take a breath and collect some thoughts, and feel free to, you know, any questions or anything I can answer, I'm happy to.
Well, I'm hearing a lot of, one of the things we try to do with these programs is to find entry points for journalists and how they can begin to cover this. And I've heard a lot of different points in here. You know, there's the old saying that politicians don't get elected on infrastructure. If I get elected, I'm going to put in more sewer lines is not something that tends to get a lot of votes. So there's a systemic problem with trying to respond, as you're saying, to try to respond in a political way to be prepared. I mean, there are three different levels here that come together, right? There's the occurrence itself, there's the exposure, so how many people, how many, what built environments, what other things are exposed to that occurrence, that risk, and then the vulnerability of that population. And you can intercede, I guess, on at least two levels on the exposure and vulnerability, but these are things that are complex and difficult for politicians to express if they're willing, or for the public to grasp and see as a need. So is that a fair assessment of what you're saying here?
Absolutely, and if I may, there was one thing I forgot to leave out, and that is recovery. So these communities that were affected by Hurricane Harvey are still recovering. The ones affected by Hurricane Maria are still recovering. Recovery, particularly to major hurricanes, takes a decade or more in most cases in the United States and in many parts of the world. And so these compound disasters are occurring in communities that are still recovering from the previous disasters. And just a few examples specific to journalism, a colleague of mine, Eve Tro, who did a lot of work in New Orleans, actually they created a recovery beat in their journalism. So someone who just focused on the recovery aspects of that and really became deep experts in that. For COVID-19, it's funny, I've actually been working with a transportation reporter at a financial publication, because all of a sudden the transportation impacts were starting to have overlap with all of this. But I really like that idea of the recovery beat, someone who could really kind of get into the weeds of the different financing mechanisms, the different social constructs of all of this, and to sort of have that lens to look through it. And I'm not sure what the best organizational approach is, but for having, you know, there's so many different angles that you can approach disasters from. And I think it's important that the more different angles you bring together, the truer picture you're getting of what's happening and who's being affected.
I know there was an effort after Sandy to do that and to track where the dollars went. There were some journalists who were working on that, and honestly, I don't know where that ended up, but I know that that was an effort to begin to look at that. But so one of the things that we've talked about in other programs about the pandemic is it's been a horrible thing, obviously, for so many people, but in a sense, it's also an opportunity. So it's exposed bad supply lines, it's exposed difficulty in the healthcare systems, and the question becomes, do you return to normal, which is fraught with all these issues already, or do you create a new normal? And I guess the question in this sense is recovery. Does recovery, there tends to be a rush after a big disaster to return to what was once there. How much effort, how much work can be done to change that focus on returning to the old normal and creating a better normal? Or is recovery overwhelmingly, let's just pay people for their roofs, let's, you know, buy new cars, and let's get back to where we were as quickly as possible?
Well, I think, you know, and we've actually been looking at this a lot. So in rhetoric, it's sort of changed to build back better and build back stronger and integrating resilience into that. What that means in practice is a little less defined, although some groups, including ours, we have a project we're working with on that with communities and affected by Hurricanes Florence and Hurricanes Maria, as how do you integrate that into your recovery planning? Now there was I can't remember the jurisdiction, but in Japan they essentially this jurisdiction put a moratorium on rebuilding for, I think it was 6 months, They said, look, we're not going to rush to rebuild. We're going to think this through. We're going to have this conversation. We're going to take a breath. Now, whether or not 6 months is an appropriate amount of time of people without housing, but it does raise an interesting idea, right? Which is that this rush to rebuild potentially could be rebuilding the same vulnerabilities that we had before. This is a big criticism of a lot of federal rebuilding programs and a push to get some of them revised is that instead of just replacing the roof, are you going to invest more in actually moving the home out of the floodplain or raising it up on stilts? And where is the trade-off with all of that? And I think these are really important questions, and they get very complicated on the physical mitigation side. And then you start looking at sociological and psychological aspects of this. You have a community that someone has lived in, their families lived in. This may be a multi-generational home. There's a community in North Carolina in a floodplain, and it's flooded out many times. It's the first community, I think, the first community created by freed slaves in North Carolina. So obviously there's a deep, deep history there, very rich and very important to the community. So do you say to them, we can't keep paying for you to be flooded out, you need to, so there are social dynamics here that are as profound, if not more so than even the physical barriers. But to that point, one of the things we're seeing with COVID is we're seeing an acceleration of certain trends in the economy. Telehealth, I don't think we're ever gonna go back to the way things were before in healthcare and the delivery of telehealth. Remote work, companies are already looking at downsizing their real estate footprints because they may not, because, why not have these, why spend all this money on all this square footage in Midtown Manhattan when we can have people working remote? So it absolutely does create some opportunities to capitalize on some of these silver linings and build resilience into that recovery if we're willing to take the breath and if we have the capacity to engage in those conversations and appreciate the complexity of those at the same time.
Radley, anything to add to that particular point?
Only that I'm having more background noise in my house than I anticipated. So I'm happy to speak a little less, and great answers from Jeff. I guess, just to sort of quickly note, we've sort of been highlighting sort of 5 dimensions of interaction between climate with COVID-19. One of them, obviously, the space of reduced emissions, concentrations of pollutants, as we saw so much social distancing. This question of how vulnerable people are to climate extremes given COVID. How is it interacting with? How is air quality and heat interacting with people who are sick or have been sick? The efficacy of some of these climate resilience strategies like cooling centers, in times of social distancing. A third category we also just heard about is this perception of impacts. Has COVID-19 given us a sort of window now where people can see beyond the abstractions and see, oh yeah, we really are vulnerable to these cascading impacts. Can that be an extra foundation to build resilience? Fourth category, also just mentioned, the sort of changes in climate relevant behaviors and norms, whether it's much less flying, much less commuting, people not needing that big commercial sort of real estate, often in floodplains, for example. And then the fifth, the sort of, where we see the biggest sort of overlap potentially, where this could really matter on climate. If the COVID-19 experience changes the long-term policy, macroeconomics, social psychology across society around issues like Green New Deal versus supporting or protecting arguably dying industries such as fossil fuels, that's the time scale of decisions, the signals that government and the private sector end up sending about various industries and how much to regulate them, whether we remove subsidies on fossil fuel, for example. That's the place that in terms of reducing greenhouse gas emissions, COVID interactions could have the biggest impacts. Although, as we just heard, there's also a lot of ways that resilience can be improved in shared ways, since it's a lot of the same communities that are suffering the most from COVID-19 that are also the most vulnerable to heat waves and other climate extremes.
If we could, we'll get to the scenario in just a few minutes, but let's talk a little bit more about communities planning for resilience that allows them to weather compound risk. What can communities do? What are some specific things that communities can do? And what can reporters look at that will help them cover these stories about about increasing capacity for resilience in the face of increasing risk?
That's a good question. I think one thing that I've kind of learned over the years is that, we use this term of capacity building in communities, and I've come to really dislike that term because it's usually coming from an NGO or some multinational actor that's coming in to tell a community what to do. And our experience working with communities has been that they have phenomenal capacity. And there are a lot of emergent actors within, and this has actually been recognized by disaster researchers for decades now, that there are emergent actors within communities, folks who don't normally see themselves as disaster responders, who step up to create new programs. And I think this is what we're seeing in a lot of the social science research on disasters, is that these emergent actors, where there's a lot of social cohesion, a lot of social capital, are able to really thrive and are leveraged and are leaned on. And so the capacity of the community is largely able to flourish. And I think that that's one of the most important things to really look for is what is the engagement process within the communities? What is the advocacy process within there? Are they engaging all the different sectors of the community as part of their preparedness efforts, their response efforts, their recovery efforts? But another piece of it has to do with the vertical integration. Does that community then have a voice at the state level and at the federal level? As Radley was alluding to earlier too, I mean, there is this bank breaking on the horizon where it's getting so expensive, and what the federal government is paying out is getting so expensive, starting to create some animosity between the states and the federal government, which has the potential to trickle down to those community levels. So I think really that engagement at all levels and making sure that the capacity that exists within the community is being heard, is being listened to, and is being leveraged to create solutions that are lasting and that are sensitive to the local dynamics and aren't reliant on external resources, but at the same time that those external resources are there. There are certain things like a pandemic where you need extraordinary amounts of ventilators and personal protective equipment that crosses borders. That is not a community problem, it's a national problem, and it's a global problem. And so that meaningful engagement really at all levels, and sort of recognizing where community capacity can and should be appropriately leveraged without absolving these larger systems of also having to have the resources to come in and support those connections and provide more good than harm in the way that those solutions are implemented and communities are engaged.
But to be clear, what I think I hear you saying is that this local capacity is important for recovery, but from that is also coming ideas, methods, things they can do to create resilience in the future. So that's not just an emergency response, as was happening in Jamaica Bay, where that guy used his storefront that he had just set up as a place where people could bring things and distribute goods, and it became this sort of self-developing, self-help sort of project for everybody in the community, with building supplies and food and other things. That's a recovery responses versus changing behavior, changing structures to become more resilient in the future. But what I think I hear you saying is that both those things are happening within those emergent actors.
Yeah, and I'll give a more specific example. So one of the projects we work on, our Resilient Children, Resilient Communities initiative, we're working in some communities in North Carolina and Puerto Rico, and previously in upstate New York and Arkansas, on building resilience focused on children in disasters. And so we provide some technical assistance, help facilitation, but really work with lead community organizations that are connecting the child serving infrastructure with the emergency management infrastructure. And they're really doing phenomenal work with this. And as part of the project, we also do policy advocacy. So they form these connections within the community and then are advocating upwards. And we help utilize our platform and the access we can garner to get them audiences with their congressional representatives, we've had meetings with the White House, with the national security staff, groups like that, talking directly with the community members. And so a recent example is, we had all these plans on what we were going to do, and then COVID-19 hit. And then we had these meetings scheduled, and we kept them, but, sort of opened up the agenda, of course. We weren't still planning for the same simulations. And all of a sudden we're hearing, just sitting back and we're watching the emergency managers talking with the diaper bank, talking with childcare centers on how to get resources to people in need. It's these networks that were established through those conversations and through those partnerships that are now being leveraged in a very different space, but very efficiently and very effectively within the community. And then to be able to articulate and advocate for the policies that are impacting, either helping or hindering their ability to respond, facilitates that vertical dialogue that's so important. And so with that, I think creating those relationships and those pathways for communication and collaboration are potentially one of the most valuable things that can be put in place.
Thank you for that. Radley, Jeff, thank you. So with time constraints, let's move on to our scenario. And this is something that we're trying to find a way to really bring this home to journalists and see how things can play out, not in real time, but at least in a conversation about things that can happen in a disaster. So we're going to walk through that scenario to see how first responders react to the challenges presented by compound risks. This scenario, of course, is not real, but the events projected here could be and could happen in many areas of the country. This scenario is set near Colorado Springs, but the same events could happen just as easily in California, Montana, Texas, or Florida. So first, let me introduce our guests. After spending a lifetime in business research and compliance, Rosemarie Smallcombe then spent another lifetime, or at least a part of one, sailing with her husband off the West Coast. She's now an elected official as the District 1 Supervisor in Maricopa County, California. Bill McLaughlin is...
No,
oh, yep.
Sorry, Mariposa.
Mariposa, thank you.
Mariposa.
Mariposa, yes.
Is butterfly in Spanish. Maricopa is in Arizona.
and also in Colorado, in a different part of Colorado. Thank you. Bill McLaughlin has been a career firefighter, training officer, and fire marshal. Today, he's the fire chief in the city of Ketchum, Idaho, and is considered one of the nation's top technical experts on wildland-urban interface issues, or WUI, as we heard earlier. Michael Kotis will also join us at the end for some comments. Michael has had a long storied journey as a photographer and journalist covering environmental issues. He's a senior editor with Inside Climate News and the author of Megafire, The Race to Extinguish a Deadly Epidemic of Flame, which I believe is quite appropriate to discussion and still on sale at your favorite independent bookseller. So with massive help from Michael, we've come up with a wildfire scenario. We'll walk through the scenario and asking for brief responses along the way from Rosemarie and Bill to various risk elements that crop up. So here we go. It's been a particularly hot summer so far in southeast Colorado with temperatures in the 90s every day. The region's been suffering from a mega drought. That's a drought that's lasted for more than 2 decades. Some local officials in the region have been having problems finding consistent water supplies. A fire protection district in a county outside of Colorado Springs has about 50 volunteer members. 20 of them are consistent responders, while the others just like to hang out at the fire station during monthly meetings. They have really good donuts, and I can attest to that. On Friday night, they're called to a grass fire that was ignited by power lines. The lines run between a dense mixed conifer forest with a rich understory and a bunch of McMansions in a suburban development. So hopefully you can picture that now. The threatened neighborhood has very uneven preparation for wildfires. Some residents have homes surrounded by vegetation that is much denser than the region held historically. This vegetation could be easily ignited, but other homeowners have done much to protect their property. So we're seeing a little variability in what's happening there. And some people who've been homebound due to the pandemic have put in a lot of recent work on their properties. So Rosemarie, let's start with you. What does an elected official do when confronted with a fire?
Well, we reach out immediately to the agency that's responsible for reacting to the fire, and typically in our area that's either CAL FIRE or the Forest Service. But we reach out to them and we establish communication mechanisms because we know that people are looking for information, and it's critical that they have accurate, timely information available as soon as possible. So setting up that communication channel is essential to provide information to my constituents, to the entire community, and to ensure that we are all looking ahead to what is necessary, not only to be able to fight the fire, but to ensure that communities respond appropriately and again in a timely fashion.
All right, Bill, you've been transplanted to Colorado. You're the chief there. 10 of the regular responders in your department have been quarantined after responding to a house fire during which they were in contact with a resident who has since been diagnosed with COVID-19. The department is unable to field enough firefighters to implement some of their preferred tactics for dealing with the fire, such as cutting fire lines. What do you do in this situation?
Well, in a situation like that, we would largely be, moving into a very defensive mode very quickly with houses threatened, shortage of personnel, which means that, efforts to contain the fire, to keep the situation small have to be abandoned. And instead, it becomes an effort simply to address keeping people alive in the short term, knowing that the situation is going to get much, much worse very quickly.
All right, so red flag weather has led to an unusually high number of other wildfires in the region, and this has strained mutual aid relationships. Now it's preventing other fire departments from offering as much assistance as possible because of fires in their own districts or concerns about sending the resources outside the district. And we've already found that several of your firefighters can't respond because of quarantine. So can you first explain what red flag weather is and then how you would respond to this problem?
Okay, sure. Red flag conditions are those conditions that are likely to cause a fire to increase rapidly in size or to have very high intensity. So, under average day conditions, fires may burn through the grass, they can burn slowly. It can be relatively easy for firefighters to actually attack the fire. Under a red flag, when you're dealing with high winds, very dry conditions, low humidity, the fires can get up into the tree canopy very quickly. They can grow very, very fast. And again, it becomes a situation where the firefighters can't take action to contain the fire at all in cases, but are simply reacting to trying to evacuate, trying to keep home people alive, trying to just, in many cases, just gather enough information about the extent of the fire and what is liable to happen. And in particular, under red flag conditions, it's very likely that it's not one fire occurring at a time, but very often multiple fires occur on the same day. So, for example, in Colorado, under those conditions, we've seen a number of single day events where multiple large fires, ignited within hours of each other, and all of them were trying to draw on the same resources. And as a result, very often, those mutual aid networks just don't exist in the way that they need to. You may call the next department over, they're already going to help a department in the other direction or dealing with their own fires. So, that's a very common scenario, unfortunately, now, and becoming more common as conditions get, we see these red flags more and more often.
So how do you respond to that? How do you, when you're facing this kind of difficulty with finding people? I mean, one response is to worry less about property and more about people with limited resources. But are there other things you can do to try and increase your capacity to be able to address the problem?
Well, certainly, we build a kind of a tiered system where, the local department will respond, then they'll call their immediate neighboring departments for whatever assistance they can. From there, they may call to a regional dispatch center to request the Forest Service, State Forestry, other departments around that state, and it'll tier all the way up to a national response. Unfortunately, there's always a delay in all of that. Each level takes additional time to work through the process. And in addition, the further that you're asking for resources to come, there's the obvious delay in how long they're going to get there and how much they're going to be able to help when the need can be very immediate. So, we would make those calls, but know very often, for example, aircraft is one of the critical shortages a lot of times around the country. And it may be that if we're calling for air tankers or helicopters, they're already in Oregon because there are multiple big fires up in Oregon burning. So, at any given time, there may be enough resources for an average day, but they may not be in the right place, and they may not be, available for that immediate need.
Okay, so now the sheriff's office has decided to order an evacuation to the most threatened neighborhoods. And Rosemary, this is something that I want you to address because there are political ramifications as well as the physical ones. But stay-at-home orders and fears of being exposed to COVID-19 while gathering in groups at evacuation shelters, something that Radley and Jeff talked about with hurricanes as well. That's leading to many residents to ignore the evacuation orders and stay in their homes despite the rapidly approaching fire. Many plan to evacuate only if they see flames that are directly threatening their homes. So as a government official, as you see this playing out, what can you do? How do you do? What's the thought process that you go through as you see this playing out here?
Well, as I mentioned before, communication is critical, and we would start mobilizing neighbors to reach out to neighbors. We would, obviously, the sheriff's office would be pulling in all of their resources to encourage people to leave. We have a very robust system for evacuation, but I think messaging ahead of time, if I'm assuming in this scenario, we have not done all that we should, but clearly part of what we need to do is to ensure that people understand that they will be safe in the shelters. And if they wait until the flames are directly threatening their homes, that it may well be too late. One of the aspects that we face here in California, up in the Sierra, is many communities have one way in and one way out. And so depending on the direction that the fire is coming from, that can significantly reduce how successfully the evacuation process can occur. If we have to go an alternate route, then many people may die simply because the method of ingress and egress it may be cut off by the fire. So a lot of it is really messaging ahead of time to ensure that people understand that we have thought this through, not only with respect to the safety of individuals, residents, but also with respect to the safety of our first responders as well. So we have been talking for some time about the COVID-19 response and what that means in our community. And we need to ensure that people understand that when they go to the evacuation centers, they are safe and they will not be evacuated until they have reached, until we need them to move. So it's a matter, and most people in our communities, because they are used to fires, we've had 3 in the last 3 years, major fires, people are used to the fact that if they respond to the evacuation order in a timely fashion, that they will be safe. And there's a much greater probability then that the first responders, the firefighters, can focus on saving their properties as opposed to being diverted to try to save individuals.
So Bill, how do you, as a fire chief, obviously you have a lot of responsibility in trying to help move, the police will help move people out there, but I would presume that there's some element of your folks who are on the front lines of being involved in this as well, or not? I mean, I guess protecting evacuation routes, some other, I guess what I'm trying to get at is there an issue with being able to fight the fire if you're called in to help with last minute evacuation of people who had not paid attention before?
Oh, absolutely. And, with that, what we see is that in a lot of times, if fire is immediately threatening a community, it may not be safe for the sheriff's personnel to be in there because they're not equipped for that and not usually as well trained in making decisions about whether a location is going to be immediately impacted. So a lot of times the firefighters will be involved very directly in that evacuation as well. And in a lot of communities, there simply isn't going to be enough resources to, to handle even just the evacuation, let alone the firefighting. So a lot of times, again, that decision has to be made. Do we try to engage the fire, keep it small, or do we, move into a situation where we're going to try to protect lives? And very often under those extreme conditions, that answer just immediately moves to the, protecting lives question. So we'll begin evacuating immediately. Our firefighters are going to be involved in that, and we will, try to deal with the fire when additional resources become available, when enough resources are available to also engage in that aspect.
Okay, we had another level to this, but I think we've beaten you up enough over this. This has been a pretty difficult scenario for both of you, and I appreciate your insights on that. What I'd like to do is bring in Michael Kotis now. And Michael, as you listen through to this, what struck you? What sorts of things that comments that you might have for how this played out and how this expands into greater risk?
Well, what has struck me, at least from my realm, having worked as a journalist covering fire for quite a while, is that these kind of compounding scenarios, and not necessarily this exact sequence, but a variety of sequences, are happening more frequently. And that we're seeing, we've pretty much focused on the wildfire aspect here. And I think, we had another level on this. So then if you move this up to a type 1 incident and you're looking for federal authorities, and it happens to be simultaneous with one of our hurricanes this year, and you've got FEMA and a variety of other people, say, responding to the Gulf Coast somewhere, the way that throws in not just one compounding factor, but a whole sequence of other compounding factors that you make all of these various responses more difficult. And at least from my point of view, I think more and more I'm looking at any incident like this as to what are the compounding factors we're going to deal with, because we're almost always going to have compounding factors anymore, it seems like. And so is it going to be, the difficulty of an evacuation, with challenging egress, like was mentioned in the Sierra. My brother lives in the Sierra, and I've visited him on any number of places where, 2-3 miles on a dead-end road, and what would happen if you had to get out of that place, and what would happen when you've only got 2 or 3 homes at the end of that dead-end road. I mean, are you going to risk firefighters' lives to evacuate 2 or 3 homes? You're probably not. And so, the thing with me with wildfires and other environmental hazards and climate-related disasters is, as a journalist, every time I go to one and I get involved in these things, I realize how much I don't understand and how complicated this math is. It's a really, really difficult equation. And that equation is solved by a variety of people who have to have really good communication, and all of them are contributing to kind of solving this, multi-layered math problem. And communications become so critically important among all of these various parties, both on a local level, a regional level, and a federal level. And communication breakdowns end up that we deal with all the time now that we're in this Zoom society, where you have a meeting with a bunch of people and a couple of people are cutting in and out. I now look at that and I think, boy, if this was an emergency management situation and we were really facing some urgency, that cutting in and out of those 2 or 3 people could totally change the way this equation is put together in a really bad way. just because, one person you cannot hear or is getting, cut aside. And there's any number of ways that communications get complicated in these things. And, the way that we arrange to share resources and share information is really easily interrupted. And so the system starts to seem very brittle to me. That it really only takes a couple of things flexing on a pressure point here that we've really had highlighted during the pandemic to have a lot of things go awry, where if you were just dealing with one of those things without all of these compounding factors and without all of these communications, it would probably be a fairly simple problem to solve.
And to be clear about the scenario, while this was a manufactured incident, any one of these elements are real and things that happen typically in a disaster like this. This is not an unusual level of complexity. In fact, it's probably somewhat mild compared to the complexity that you would face in these sorts of situations. Bill, is that an accurate representation?
Yes, I think absolutely. We're already, this year in particular, we're dealing with exactly these sort of scenarios and have multiple times already. And not only are we dealing with, the compounding factor of having fewer responders, during a time where there's, weather contributing to, high risk fire situation. But then we've got the compounding factors of how we support a response during a time when we're trying to social distance everything. So, that makes it much more difficult when, normally when you throw 1,000 firefighters at a fire, you've also got the issues of feeding them and all of the logistics behind it. And then, another factor that's really started to play in is that many governments are now looking at financial implications from reduced revenue, which is, adding a whole nother level to this whole, scenario. Is how are we going to be able to respond to potentially more complex problems while at the same time trying to manage on a lower revenue source?
I'd kind of like to follow up on that too.
Sure.
It's a question, for all of our previous panelists, really. And from my point of view, one change that seemed to be really positive over the last couple of decades in dealing with wildfire was, we had Molly mention earlier the out by 10 a.m. policy, which, aside from some of the obvious problems with that, seemed to reflect to me one issue that we had, which was that we wanted to have this blanket policy for wildfire across the country without recognizing that we have infinite types of forest types and communities and situations, and you really can't apply, a really, really coarse planning and response to all kinds of different forests. A lodgepole pine forest here in Colorado is a different kind of hazard than a chaparral forest in Southern California. But now we've also, now that we've kind of broken it down and we allow firefighting responses to really focus on the kind of granular level of what's this community like, what's this ecosystem like, we've also allowed that to be part of how, at least my understanding is, how we're dealing with COVID. In the firefighting realm, whereas different states and different regions are managing things a little bit differently. And how does that complicate a federal response where maybe you were dealing with COVID in the Southeast, dealing with a fire where we've just finished a fairly active fire season, but we deal with fires very differently there. And some of those firefighters, if they're at the federal level, are going to go, say, to the Pacific Northwest or to California, where things are being done quite a bit differently, both as far as firefighting, but also in some ways as far as managing COVID, not just among the firefighters, but among the communities. Some states are opening back up, the various businesses are getting active again. So how does that complicate the firefighting response from a federal level? maybe start with Bill, since I've picked on you so many times in the past.
Yeah, so, it's, there, obviously at the operational level, there are, people are making different decisions in different areas. There's been a push to, try to make resources more self-sufficient. So in other words, they're asking, if you're going to, come assist with our fire, can you do it without, us having to get a caterer, set up sleeping arrangements and all of that. And instead, the firefighters just have to take care of themselves. And in other cases, they're bringing in, additional medical and doing testing right on, the fire line, which obviously would complicate things as well. And it has impacted as well, sort of the bigger picture in what we're doing with that. As last year was really a push toward, trying to utilize those kind of systems to allow more natural fire, to kind of increase that, the decision making to, let fires do their thing when they're not immediately threatening. This year, that's really swung back around very hard, in that the efforts are to try to contain everything as quickly as possible, so that we don't have to build these, small cities of responders that, to respond to fires. And I think, one of the things that all of us in the firefighting realm have known for a long time is that, because of the kind of conditions that wildland firefighters are in, actually there's a big problem with hygiene and health. It's a common thing that various sicknesses will go through these firefighting camps every year. And certainly that's been a big, factor playing on everybody's mind as to how can we, kind of diversify our response to keep that risk down.
Michael, could I just jump in and say that, and Bill is much closer to this than I, but what I'll tell you from my perspective, listening to folks at the state, local, and federal levels, is that there's a lot of communication going on pretty much all the time. That's something that a lot of my residents, even in the Sierra, they're not aware of. But for example, with respect to the COVID-19 response, I sit in on a state level meeting that includes federal agencies, and they're sharing notes all the time about what are we doing, how are we going to manage COVID-19 during our fire responses. And so one of my objectives is to try to make sure that the residents in our communities understand that conversation is going on, as well as all of the conversations that go on all the time to talk about, okay, what's happening now? Where are the increased risks, and how will we respond to those risks? So it's a very dynamic situation that a lot of folks who live in our communities are not aware of. And that's part of what creates so much anxiety, not only around wildfires, but the compound situations.
So I want to bring up, I'm sorry, go ahead, Mike.
I was just going to, ask one other question, kind of following up on Bill's point there, which was something that, as a journalist, kind of, took me a while to wrap my head around. But this idea that very aggressive initial response is usually, particularly in a bad fire season, a way to save money. And it seems, counterintuitive that throwing a lot of bodies and a lot of resources at small fires is going to save you money in the long run. But the idea being that you're preventing any of those small fires from turning into a project fire that could tie up thousands of firefighters and resources for weeks or months on end. So it saves money in the long run. And I'm kind of curious, Rosemary, at least for starters, as to, how does that complicate budgets? Because, so many communities are having their budgets impacted by COVID. As to whether, that falls into this equation now, where, we're trying, we're doing less prescribed in a lot of places because of, the risk that we, may not be able to manage it the way that we would like, and this could become very expensive. But we're also, responding to a lot more fires up front with the hopes of kind of containing costs at a time when all kinds of communities across the country are having their budgets just crushed by this pandemic.
Well, there's no question that the budgets at the federal level, the state level, and the local level will influence conversations about where and how we respond. I assume you're still talking about wildfire, but in that context, I think Headwaters International, and Molly is more familiar with them than I, but they did a study that indicated that the actual suppression costs are about 10% of the full costs of a wildfire. And so given that, even if that seems maybe a little bit of an overstatement, and I'm not questioning their research methodology, but it's a factor that we have to take into consideration, and it says that we do have to respond early. We have to respond hard, because the risk to communities and to property, to individuals, is much greater if we let a fire go, and the longer term economic impacts will be significantly greater as well. And we just can't afford that.
Well, and this goes back, and I want to bring Radley and Jeff in just a moment here, because this gets at the idea of response to risk in many different ways, and the extent of that response and how that might prevent further knock-on risk from occurring. But I want to ask Molly real quick if she has anything to add into this, and then we'll bring that back to Jeff and Radley to bring this out to the bigger picture again.
Well, I think it's the age-old conundrum of how we look at investments in mitigation, the long term versus the immediate need of exactly that. All of the good reasons why we need to put a fire out. I think what we know is the challenges at some point, no matter how good we are with our suppression capabilities, some of those, very few, but some will escape. And the question, I think, becomes how many and what will happen when they do. And that's sometimes when we see a paradise event, for example. So it's just, it's a difficult situation, I think, in terms of our resilient structures in the future. What we've talked about is how we have to move quickly and creatively in our thinking, and recognizing that there will be trade-offs. And unfortunately, there aren't these perfect solutions, at least in the short term. There will be trade-offs, and in some cases, there may be more regulations required to implement some of these strategies. We haven't talked about this, but a good example would be public safety power shutoffs. That's a perfect example of a trade-off where you're solving one problem, but you're creating others. And I think that that's the difficult situation we're all in.
Do you, and anybody can pipe in on this, just a really quick question, but, we talk about, the annual fire borrowing, at the federal level, where, the federal government typically would run out of money for wildfire response, in August or September in a bad fire year, and have to take money from other pots to make up for that. And usually it was from preparations, either, thinning programs or, prescribed burning programs, et cetera. I'm assuming, but correct me if I'm wrong, that most of the folks I've talked to are anticipating that this is really going to hit, programs to prepare for the next wildfire hard. And do you know of anybody who's doing any kind of research on how much the pandemic and just this unusual disaster response situation that we have this year is going to impact preparations for the next disaster? Any thoughts on that?
Or
yeah, I was aiming it at you, but anybody can pipe in.
I think we're still in the very early phases of knowing what that's going to look like. I think it's almost too soon to wrap our minds around what some of the budget shortfalls are and where they're going to be taken from to make up for other areas. And I think that speaks exactly to, though, the conundrum of, we know politically and justifiably for all of the right social reasons, we can't decide to not put out a fire when lives are at risk. And so we know that response funding will be prioritized over, potentially over, some other funding priorities. And that is the ultimate question, is how do we, and one of the speakers spoke to this earlier, I think it was Jeff, I was really intrigued by it, is so far, preparedness funding isn't what drives people to the ballot box. So I think our question is, as a practitioner, what are those right messages that we can drive home? Or for journalists, what is that story behind, how do you speak to mitigation and the investments in the future when we know that's what we need to do, but we don't quite know always how to get there?
All right, so let's bring Jeff and Radley back in and expand this back out from more than just wildfires. But your thoughts real quickly, and then we'll see if there are any questions, but your thoughts on what you heard in the scenario and how that played out. Jeff, why don't you go first?
Sure, wasn't sure. I figured I was pretty long-winded earlier. I should give someone else a chance. No, yeah. Well, I think these issues, in terms, they're very obviously very complex. I very much appreciate the granularity in the decision making that that folks gave in terms of, and honesty in terms of how this would be. I'm reminded, I actually had the privilege, we were doing some work out in LA, and I got to spend a day with some members of the LA Fire, and was able to see the burn site from the Getty Fire last year, and driving up there, up Tiger Tail Road. And I was reminded of that when you were talking about these communities with one way in and one way out, but also these very narrow roads. And I was talking with a colleague from the fire service about, just some questions on, what do you think about this? And, he was telling me kind of the history, right? That back in the day, these were the actors' bungalows that were put up on the hill. And it was never really designed to be these $1 million homes overlooking the valley. And he was showing me the contours of the different canyons and the way that the fire shoots up and how they have to respond to those. And then was talking about the issue that they had. We're driving up in just a little, SUV, and they had to bring apparatus up there. I don't know how they got it down, because they had to turn it around at some point. And then as we're looking down, he's showing me sort of what houses are burning and which ones aren't. And things like the vegetation, like people don't want to clear out all the trees that give shade around all their house. So I was struck by, there are these trade-offs, right? You can build areas that are less vulnerable to fire, or you can accept the risk that there's more likely to be a fire. But then I look at my colleague here who's on the front lines of fighting these fires, and who's paying for it, and who's on the front lines, and who's really in danger from all of this. So I think understanding how these risks are translated into our development decisions, I don't think it's realistic to simply say nobody can ever build in anything that is not 100% ideal, whether in a floodplain or a fire prone area or anything like that. Again, there are too many other factors involved. But is it always the responsibility of government, or should this be in the building regulations? Should it be the developers that actually pay into a pool for this? Should it be on the burden of individuals? And so looking at other parts of the system that can incentivize or de-incentivize this. I have an article out in Government Finance Review with my colleague Jackie Ratner, looking at how ESG ratings for bonds are developed, and how climate change hazards are mostly calculated under environment, when governance actually has a much stronger sway in terms of these bond ratings, when in fact the disasters affect your tax base, they affect your local agencies and all these things. So in a sense, this is just one example of a long-term financial incentive that understates the risk. And potentially makes it easier to develop in areas that could be at risk down the road. That has very little to do with government regulations and tax dollars, and a lot to do with those private sector investments and how they're valued and disincentivized. So I think we should also be creative across all of the different sectors for doing this, to make sure that should the fire break out, and all of you are doing your job very heroically to respond to this, whether from the elected official perspective of the fire service or elsewhere, that it's been a setup for success as much as possible. So with that, I'll hand it over to Radley.
Yeah, I think, not too much to add, really more just sort of a question on my part of, to what extent insurance may be starting in the West to become a kind of transformative piece. And, at the sort of homeowner or other asset level. Then also there's tie-ins, right, to the electric utilities, including liabilities. So yeah, a lot of dimensions, and I guess also opportunities to some extent for everyone from builders or developers who are starting to prepare for some of these hazards. Although I think it's important that everyone be really honest about the extent of the challenges. It's not just a question of making a building that's less, a roof that's protects against embers better, right? That's maybe something critical, but not not going to be nearly enough. One other just sort of random thread, I guess, would be that the air quality dimension. I don't know if I had to step away. I apologize for a while, but that's one dimension to the fires too, with a long, with a sort of long geographic signature too, and obviously of super direct relevance to the firefighters too. So just a couple thoughts there.
All right, I'm having problems getting into the onlinequestions.org, unfortunately. So I'm going to ask those I can see. If you have any questions, John, Muriel, if any of you have any questions, let me know. But and Michael, if you have anything else that you want to throw in as well. But what I want to wrap up with, if we're out of questions, is to ask each participant if they have, and you don't have to do this, but if you have a thought of an entry point for journalists, something that you think, a story that's being missed on these issues, or if there is some issue that you think is worthy of better coverage or more coverage, what that might be and what you would suggest to a reporter who comes to you and asks how to cover compound risk, what you think what story you think they should be looking at first. So Michael, do you have any other questions that you want to throw in here, or?
Well, hundreds, but no. I mean, I'm much more interested in hearing from everybody else.
Okay, so why don't we, Muriel, do you have any questions? I see your hands up, so let me, if you can't.
Actually, not a question, but I just wanted to share a little bit about recovery and rebuilding. Think about resource constraints. I have started bugging people not to be thinking about denominating prices in terms of dollars, but also kilowatt hours and greenhouse gases, because on a global level, we're looking at some serious resource constraints. And I have a couple of videos that I will send to Dale, and he can share them with you guys.
Great. So sort of like what they do with utilities when they put the notice up about how much electricity that you'll be using, but more expanded warning label of sorts. Hang on.
When you go to the store, look at every product and just think to yourself, what's the embodied energy? We're taking it all for granted, but we've got to start thinking about it.
Okay, thanks. So Andy, sure. Whoop, did I still muted for some reason? I'm not able to unmute you, so there you go.
Okay.
Yep.
Thank you for organizing this, first of all. I guess my question's for Jeff and sort of the general emergency management community. Where is this conversation not happening? Or is this conversation ever happening, meaning at the local level? Connecting practitioners, media, and science in ways that can identify general characteristics of emergency response systems that are adaptive and can handle these multiple overlapping sectors of risk. Does this happen?
You know, I guess in a roundabout way to get to your question, one of the things that really fascinates me is what are the different business models of the different sectors of civil society. what sort of influences what we choose to do and what we don't choose to do. I mean, I think in general, you know, at the local level is where you tend to see the most adaptation, because that's where you have the most kind of connections and relationships with folks within the community, particularly in smaller communities. Larger ones like New York, you have a lot of bureaucracy put in place, you have a lot of protocols, you have a lot of checklists and things you have to follow. And those sort of steer you to making certain kinds of decisions over in one way over others. So to give example, you know, you look at some of these build it back programs after major storms, and you look at the number of people going in, and then you look at the number of people who come out the other side, and it's a fraction of how many people originally applied. Now, some of them are denied, some of them are ineligible, but a lot of people just give up because they just can't wait 2 years to get funding to rebuild and things like that. So I think so to answer your question more directly, I think that there are some adaptive conversations going on. I think right now they're best practices. They're things that we actually should do more to learn from. And
but are they ratcheting forward to disaster risk reduction?
Yeah.
Again, you know, it's adaptive after the fact. This rebuilding is different than let's get it less wrong the next time.
Yeah, I don't think so generally, which isn't to say that it doesn't happen. I think that it does happen in a lot of communities. So I want to be very careful here, because I think, and I see Rosemary, and I definitely do want to hand it to you, that I think in a lot of communities it really is happening. But when I'm looking at the data in aggregate, when I'm looking at year after year of more and more billion-dollar disasters, and I'm looking at communities that are doing buyback programs in floodplains, but then developing more aggressively in the same floodplains, it's not moving the needle in aggregate, but it is meaningfully moving the needle in the areas where there are these more progressive and more integrated approaches that I have a feeling Rosemary's going to talk about.
Well, thank you. I alluded to this earlier when we were talking about conversations for disaster preparedness, particularly with respect to wildfires. Here in California, in October of 2015, Governor Brown issued an emergency proclamation on tree mortality, and CAL FIRE and our Office of Emergency Services stood up a tree mortality task force that continued meeting until I think about 1.5 years ago, when it was replaced by a forest management task force. So we are trying to move more toward how do we create more resilient forests and communities. And so it is a conversation that's been going on now for about 5 years. It's slow, and we have included what is called the Science Advisory Panel, and they're they present at the task force meetings, and they are part of the working group meetings. So we are trying to find ways to integrate the scientific perspective, the latest scientific information with what's happening in the different agencies, and how do we work better among the different agencies at the state, local, and federal levels to use the resources that we have more efficiently, and also to plan better for what we know is coming in some form or fashion.
Great, thank you. Mike, you have your hand up there? Quick
So,
question, if you could.
Just following up on Andy's question, and maybe start with Jeff, but Rosemary probably has something to say about it, possibly Molly. At least in the wildfire realm, there have been a lot of perverse incentives that have kept us from doing things that we know we need to do. In the overall view of this compounding of dealing with disasters and all of this, are you seeing some perverse incentives, some things that we mentioned the insurance industry earlier, and at times the insurance industry has not been as helpful with these problems as it could have been. Are there other perverse incentives that are keeping us from moving as quickly on these issues as we could?
Yeah, I mean, so the short answer is yes. And I think that this is actually the ultimate issue, right? When we're talking about business models, whether it's business or government or individuals, when they engage in transactions, everyone agrees and advocate, climate change is bad. And I would venture to say that even those who deny climate change, there's probably a number who believe that it's true. But if you're competing on a global market with other companies that are not putting scrubbers on their smokestacks or otherwise adapting to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, you're less competitive and you can't stay in business. So I think that is the ultimate nut to crack. In fact, is that, I think there's a lot, the more that we have these kinds of groups coming together to bring in the science with the politics, with the folks on the ground that Rosemary's been describing. I think that those are critically important, as well as to use those as a model for building on a larger scale, because we can't, a colleague of mine said it best, but I'm going to steal it. We can't grant and regulate our way into resilience, that's a part of it, but getting into these incentive structures, a builder who's going to get paid when the development is done next year is less interested in what the risk is over 30 years. Now, the bondholder for that development is quite a bit more interested. And those are the organizations and those are the industries that seem to be more progressive in terms of looking at this. Insurers with actuarial tables, there's a mixed bag, and Radley probably knows more about this than I do. But let me rephrase it, definitely knows more about this than I do. But that, if you have actuarial tables that are looking back at historical records versus integrating modeling and what is the quality of that modeling. I know there are some researchers at the Earth Institute looking to sort of create more of a standard practice for how those models are integrated into forecasts so that you do have better valuation of risk in those transactions that are engaged in all the time that actually lead to on the ground resilience or lack thereof.
Radley, do you want to add to that, or you're okay?
I think that was a great summary. I think these, the types of sort of quantitative approaches among physical scientists, experts in vulnerability across real estate are a much needed step, a critical step. But I think it also needs to be said that there's probably also going to be a piece here that's very difficult to quantify. So let's do all we can to get the more precise information, including various economic metrics. That'll be a very helpful step, but it'll never get us, I think, all the way to where we need to be for a variety of reasons, including the types of cascading impacts, equity dimensions, human safety dimensions, which are very, very hard to quantify, but critical, obviously.
All right, we're up against our time here, so if we could just very quickly do a quick whip around of everybody to see if you have any story ideas you want to throw out. Why don't I start, Molly? Do you have anything any one thing that you thought would be of interest to journalists here?
Well, it's not so much a story, but maybe a tip is that often I see in wildfires coverage that there are many either or solutions. It's either about the forest or it's about the development, and that's the focus. And so I think what we've really pointed out today is there's this constellation of challenges, and I know that's makes for a more complex story, but I think that would be one thing I'd just suggest is to look beyond that dichotomy of it's one or the other, and that's how we got here today. But how can you acknowledge all of these factors that are contributing to exactly what we're talking about?
And in those stories, I would like to ban the phrase at the end, "Only time will tell." So that's my contribution here. Bill, do you have anything you want to throw in?
Yeah, I think, kind of following up what Molly was saying, a lot of my experience with journalists covering events has been that the coverage starts when the event gets notable. And I think that where we seem to be lacking, it's sort of like the influence of dollars going to prevention. There also isn't nearly as much interest in kind of looking at what communities are doing or what environments exist or what potential factors might be in a place that would lead to those events occurring. And so, if I would like to see more effort, in kind of being ahead of, having stories that are ahead of the flames hitting the edge of town. And
so
I think
advanced stories, yeah.
Exactly, yeah. That that would help out a lot with public understanding of the risk as well, because we have a very limited reach on our own. As local agencies or even as federal agencies in kind of educating the public at large about, what's out there and what could happen in the future.
Thanks. Rosemarie?
I would echo what Bill said. I think one of the things that went through my mind as we were talking, and it's something I think about a fair amount, and that is how much variation there is across communities in terms of the risks that even firefighters fight or face when they're out fighting the fires, right? There's terrain, there's tree mortality in our area. There are so many risk factors even in our small area, and when we look at it at a state level and we have the conversation about, we know these disasters are increasing in severity and increasing in number, and how do we respond to them? I guess I would like to see more conversation up front about not only that complexity and variability, but also what it means for individuals. Like somebody mentioned the house out at the end of the 2 or 3 mile road. It has significance. I lost a family out at the end of a 2 mile road in our area in our last fire. So it is life or death. And I think journalists seem to like to focus on the impacts on individuals and what's happening with people. And in a lot of our communities, we have a significant proportion of older folks who are very vulnerable. And I'd like to see that kind of exploration of the environment that we all have to work in, and hopefully develop plans that will reduce the risk.
Thanks. Susanna, anything that you'd like to throw out there?
For me, a frustration is every time there is a hurricane, the questions I get is always wanting a big headline in terms of climate change instead of coming and talking about the preparedness, the risk that's there all the time, and then the journalists try to always gear toward, but don't you want to say, you know, something is exploding or something like that, you know, don't you want to say this, trying to put the words in my mouth. And I would prefer that the focus should be first how the forecasts have been progressing the last few years and what the community could do to be more prepared to that event and what has been done, instead of so much focus on the event. Put more focus in preparedness and resilience and what could be done about that.
One of the reasons for doing programs like this is to increase the capacity of journalists to be able to ask those questions, to give them the knowledge so they can be more granular in how they're looking at things, rather than grasping at sort of the big things that just happen to come to mind. But I think it's an important issue to keep talking about. Michael, do you have anything to throw in real quick? And then we'll go to Jeff and Radley to wrap up.
I'm going to follow up on Bill and Rosemary's point. You know, just as a journalist who started out as that person who showed up when the fire blew up because it's breaking news, and a breaking news story is very constrained for a journalist. You know, you're up against this time deadline, and you're really focused on our lives at risk, is property at risk. You know, how are we dealing with this? And you got maybe an hour on the fire line or at a command center getting some answers to questions and then knocking out that story. And I think that what really served me far better later on was to go and visit people like Bill and visit a forest with them, and maybe take a walk through a forest with a forester or a firefighter before that disaster happens, when they're saying this is a hazard, and explain that hazard to me, and what type of tree is this, and how dense was it historically, and are there photos of that? And then go and spend some time with the people who live in that forest and talk to them about how they perceive that hazard, and maybe a policymaker and a land manager, and get to know that one area, particularly if you're a local journalist, so that you kind of understand how these things are going to come to bear on that. You can do that. I've done it with hurricanes too. Go and spend some time in these beach communities where the houses are going to be threatened, with somebody who can talk about how this beach is going to erode, and then talk to the homeowners and the policymakers. And once you've done that a couple of times as a journalist, you can start to apply that thinking to different landscapes and know, a better set of questions to ask, so that when you are responding to that breaking news situation, yeah, you've got to do all those basic ground questions about, threats to life and property, but you also will have some better informed questions to ask that will help you really provide a story that helps people understand the hazard and how this happened in a much bigger sense.
That's excellent. Thanks, Michael. Radley?
So I've got a pretty specific pitch that's in a slightly different direction than what we've mostly been talking about. It's getting towards the combinations of heat and humidity again. So in a sense, some of the opposite conditions for extreme fire. Here we're talking about high levels of humidity and high levels of temperature. So to try and put it as succinctly as possible, we're all sort of familiar with the expression, it's not the heat, it's the humidity. We intuitively understand that people are more vulnerable to heat stress and a lot of health conditions. The humidity is also high. And yet, if you talk to a lot of epidemiologists in the US and Europe, places that maybe don't get the worst combinations of heat and humidity, a lot of them will tell you when they look at the historical data, they don't actually need the humidity to predict how many people are how many excess heart attacks there are going to be, how many excess renal failures, for example. But my suspicion is, based on some of our research, which we're going to share, there are some parts of the world where combinations of heat and humidity, like the Persian Gulf, South Asia, already are getting so high that we essentially know that humidity has to be a really important predictor for the ability of people to do outdoor labor, perform in school. And so there's a whole series of questions around what's actually happening in those places. How are people surviving? How are they coping? Is there awareness of how the risk is going to change? Can we get access to the basic epidemiological data, economic productivity data, to understand whether humidity is a really important factor, as it intuitively ought to be, but this is a major gap. We're putting out papers saying that there are parts of the world right now where it's so hot and humid occasionally that the healthiest human in the world cannot survive for a long period of time outdoors, even with an endless supply of water. But we're having trouble drawing those links down the chain to the impact. So I think that's going to be a huge research area going forward. And there's definitely a role for journalism in a variety of ways, many of which I probably can't even begin to imagine.
Great, thank you. Jeff, you get the last word?
All right. I think just echoing, I think what a lot of other folks have said too, is that, disasters are extraordinarily complex, and they're the product of the context in which they happen within, and understanding that context, what led to it, what is the evenness or unevenness across the community. And so I would say, I guess both to journalists to really explore that, but also to editors and owners to give your staff the space to do that. It's not lost on me, the just extreme difficulty that journalism faces today economically, and that I'm asking a lot to say to spend more time and spend more money, but I think it truly, truly will pay off. And while you're at it, maybe dial back some of the clickbait headlines a little bit. It doesn't really help us.
Jeff, thank you. Thanks all of you for joining us today. A quick process note for the journalists: a video of this webinar will be posted in the next few days at the Earth Institute blog called State of the Planet. The address is blogs.ei.columbia.edu. Along with the video, I'll include a blog post, and there will be links to resources, along with story ideas you can use to begin your coverage of risk. I hope you'll check it out and also look at the other videos that make up the Resilience Media Project. The Resilience Media Project is a part of Andy Revkin's new initiative at the Earth Institute called Sustain What? Sustain What is a global conversation focused on identifying concrete solutions to the complicated challenges of humanity today. Our primary focus is on making sense of the changes impacting our Earth and biological systems. In light of the outbreak of COVID-19, the main focus of our sessions is on mitigating the unfolding societal disruption and devastation driven by this pandemic, and teaching journalists how to better respond to these issues. At the same time, we're also focusing on ways to build more resilient, inclusive, and sustainable communities in the years ahead. You can check out Andy's program as well as mine at the Earth Institute website. My thanks to all our guests, and thank you for joining us, and I look forward to seeing you all again at future programs. Thanks again. Bye, everybody.